At the Met Gala, everyone laughed at her. They thought she was lost. But after an hour, the whole room fell silent. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The night air carried with it the charge of anticipation, heavy and electric, the kind that thrums just beneath the skin. New York City thrived on spectacle, and no spectacle was more intoxicating, more opulent, more ruthless than the Met Gala. On the first Monday in May, the city transformed. Fifth Avenue was choked with limousines, velvet ropes, flashing lights, and crowds that spilled beyond the barricades, clutching phones and posters, screaming names like prayers into the night. The Met stood like a jewel box waiting to be opened. Its grand steps, draped in crimson, were the altar. The celebrities who ascended them were the deities of the moment. Every eye, be it behind a camera lens or framed by a pair of oversized sunglasses, was trained on that staircase, that sacred runway where fashion and fame met in a single exhale. They came in waves. Beyoncé was among the first, a living sculpture of gold and defiance, her train carried like the mantle of a queen. Zayn Malik arrived in a custom black suit with silver armor over one arm, walking like he knew the world, watched, and owed him thanks for it. Zendaya followed in a glowing gown that shifted hues with every step, a modern fairy tale brought to life. Rihanna, never one to be upstaged, arrived draped in a cloud of sculpted white silk, her headpiece glittering like ice under museum lights. Their names rolled across social media timelines. Captions bloomed in real time. Beyoncé shuts it down. Zendaya serves pure magic. Rihanna is mother. The press bay was a riot of sound. Photographers bellowed commands like drill sergeants. Left shoulder, right here. Give us the back. Turn, baby, turn. Microphones thrust forward like weapons. Reporters spoke in rapid-fire tongues, their lanyards fluttering in the breeze kicked up by helicopters above. Somewhere between the shouts and the flashbulbs, a black sedan pulled up to the curb without fanfare. No police escort, no trailing convoy, no stylist hopping out first to fluff a gowns train or shield the guest from the press. The engine purred like a secret, and the driver stepped out with the kind of grace that spoke of discipline, not obligation. He opened the rear door slowly, not to delay, but to honor. She stepped out alone. There was no gasp from the crowd, no turn of heads, no surge in camera clicks. She wasn't clad in crimson tulle or dripping in jewels. Her dress was black, matte, unbranded, and devastating in its simplicity. Sleeveless, floor-length, with a subtle structure that hinted at craftsmanship but carried no label anyone could identify at first glance. It hugged where it should and flowed where it needed. There was no slit, no glitter, no spectacle. Just silk and movement and her. Her skin gleamed like bronze under the lights, not from powder, but from presence. Her hair was straight and parted with precision, tucked behind her ears. No bun, no extensions, no towering headpiece. A thin diamond chain graced her collarbone, catching the light not with flash, but with restraint. On one finger, her left, sat a ring, delicate and unassuming. She carried no clutch, no phone, no visible security. She didn't smile, didn't pose, didn't look to the crowd for validation. She simply walked. Some heads turned, but only in confusion. One blogger in sequins whispered to his cameraman, "Did someone's assistant get confused?" A stylist nudged another and rolled her eyes. She better not block the next shot. The cameras remained fixed elsewhere. Her name was not screamed from behind the barricades. There were no stylists racing up behind her to adjust a train, no PR reps hissing press lines into her ear. She moved up the crimson steps like she had every right to be there, because she did, and yet the silence that followed her ascent was not reverent. It was confused, disbelieving. She reached the top of the stairs where security flanked the glass doors of the museum. One of them, a tall, pale man with a polished headset, stepped forward instinctively, hand raised just enough to halt a lesser presence. "Name?" he asked, polite but taut, eyes already scanning her dress. "Mia Daniels," she replied evenly. He tapped a tablet, lips pressed in a line as he scrolled. For a moment, the cursor hovered. His brow furrowed, then relaxed. He stepped aside with a slight bow, not exaggerated, not performative. Respectful. "Right this way." She nodded once and entered. Inside, the grand atrium of the Met unfolded in soft amber light. The room had been transformed. Gold draped from the ceilings in rippling silk installations. Spotlights washed the marble floors in honeyed tones. Waitstaff in custom uniforms moved like chess pieces across the floor, carrying trays of champagne and canapes with the weightless grace of ghosts. At the center, a towering floral sculpture spiraled toward the dome, an homage to the night's theme, forgotten icons. As Mia stepped in, the air changed, though no one could say how or why. She was neither loud nor ostentatious. She simply was, and that was enough to ripple the silence like a stone skimming a still lake. But the guests noticed, not overtly, not right away, but slowly, as she moved further into the room. There was a shift in posture here, a longer than usual glance there. A model turned her head just enough to whisper something into a designer's ear. A fashion editor narrowed her eyes and took a sip of her drink, scanning Mia from shoes to shoulders. They didn't know who she was. And in this room, not being known was a threat. At a table near the center of the room, a young influencer furrowed her brow. "She's not tagged in any of the arrivals," she muttered, scrolling frantically. "How is that possible?" Her companion, a reality TV starlet in custom latex, leaned closer. "Maybe she's like a background actor, or a performance piece." "No," the first one snapped, eyes narrowing. "She's sitting at table 6, that's an A-list table." As Mia took her seat, heads turned, though no one approached. No one quite dared to ask who she was. But the assumptions brewed quickly. One server hesitated before offering her a drink, uncertain whether to hand her a tray or a flute. Another woman nearby asked softly if she could get her a napkin. Mia responded with a nod, gently, without correcting them. They didn't know yet. They weren't supposed to. The night had just begun. Across the room, Anna Wintour entered with her signature bob and sunglasses, glancing around with the quiet, deadly precision of a general surveying the battlefield. She paused, only for a moment, as her eyes flicked toward Mia's table. No expression, no greeting, just a lingering glance that held something no one else yet understood. In a sea of sequins and strategy, Mia sat still, poised, alone, but not unnoticed. The room hadn't learned her name, not yet, but it would, and when it did, it wouldn't forget, not ever. The subtle hum of chamber music drifted through the cavernous expanse of the Met's great hall, weaving between marble columns and echoing off centuries-old statues that watched silently from their pedestals. The exhibit had not yet opened, but the opulence of the evening was already in full bloom. Waiters glided like shadows through the spaces between guests, balancing crystalline flutes on polished silver trays. The air shimmered with perfume, ambition, and carefully calibrated charm. Inside, the mood was electric and exclusive. To the untrained eye, the room was filled with effortless grace. But to anyone who knew better, it was a battlefield of subtle performance. Smiles stretched over sharpened teeth, gowns worn like armor, nods exchanged as strategic as any chess move. Fame here was currency, and every introduction was a transaction. Mia Daniels moved through it like a ghost who had remembered she was alive. Her steps were neither hurried nor hesitant. She passed a trio of women in matching couture, their shoulders dusted with feathered embellishments and their wrists encased in diamonds. One of them caught sight of her and, in that instant, offered a half smile. No teeth, no warmth, just the twitch of obligation. Another woman, older, with a hair the color of frost and a neckline that dipped scandalously low for her age, arched a carefully shaped brow. "I thought they had a strict dress code," she murmured to her companion, eyes still fixed on Mia. "No theme, no drama, no designer." Her friend replied, "It's probably archival Margiela. They're doing that stealth wealth nonsense this year." Mia didn't turn, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge. Her expression remained untouched, but she heard it all. She always did. The table placements were posted on tall gilded stands near the entrance to the inner exhibition hall. A small knot of guests clustered around them, fingers tapping screen-printed paper with precision. Mia approached, glanced at the list, found her name, Table 6. She didn't linger. As she moved toward her destination, the noise of the room seemed to swell and contract around her, like a tide waiting to pull her under. At her table, a group had already begun to assemble. A tech CEO in a structured charcoal suit that practically screamed money leaned back with the air of a man who'd never heard the word no. Beside him, a pop star with rhinestones woven into her hair twirled a silver fork with idle boredom. A politician's wife in crimson chiffon clutched a glass of white wine like a weapon. Mia pulled out the chair marked with her name and sat down. The conversation at the table stalled briefly, like someone had turned down the volume. It wasn't an overt pause, no gasps, no stares, but the shift was palpable. One of the women coughed lightly and adjusted her posture. The tech magnate glanced down at his place card, then at hers, then away again. A server approached with wine. Mia declined politely. The server hesitated a beat too long before nodding and stepping back. Moments later, a guest at the next table leaned over. Her voice was sugar-sweet and hollow. "I'm sorry, do you need something? I can flag one of the attendants for you." Mia turned her head, eyes meeting hers directly. "No, thank you." "Oh," the woman said, surprised. You're a guest." Before Mia could respond, the woman's companion tugged her arm and whispered something sharply. They both laughed, one hand covering their mouths, the other gripping the stems of their glasses with freshly manicured nails. The music swelled. The laughter faded into the din. But Mia felt it all, the tension, the scrutiny, the performance unfolding like a play where she was cast in a role she never auditioned for. At a nearby table, two influencers recorded a live stream recap of the arrivals. "Honestly, theme-wise, this year's been kinda safe," one said, brushing platinum hair over her shoulder. "Except for the woman in the black dress. Did you see her?" "Oh my God, yes," the other replied. "Like, was that supposed to be commentary, minimalism, or did she just show up off-theme on purpose?" "She looked like a guest at someone's funeral." The first snorted. "Or a server who got lost." A burst of laughter followed, quickly swallowed by another crescendo of strings from the quartet in the west alcove. Mia lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip. Behind her, someone dropped a fork. Metal rang against porcelain. Heads turned. A waiter appeared in an instant, scooping up the utensil and replacing it with one smooth motion. The guest apologized profusely to those around her. It was a minor moment, one barely registered in the evening's tapestry, but to Mia it was a reminder of the fragility beneath all this polish. One misstep, and the illusion cracked. Across the room, a fashion critic for the Times watched her. He didn't hide it. His eyes followed her, brows furrowed in a way that suggested not judgment, but confusion. He pulled out his phone and began typing. Mia remained still. A few moments later, the woman to her right spoke. "Excuse me," she said with tight politeness. "I believe there's been a mix-up. This is table 6. Mia turned her head. "Yes," she said, voice calm. "That's correct." The woman blinked. "It's just, I thought, sorry, never mind." She smiled, brittle as spun glass, and turned away. Later, as the main courses were served, more whispers traveled the air like perfume. Someone leaned across to ask if Mia worked with the museum. Another inquired, sotto voce, if she was part of the installation. A man with sharp cheekbones and a sharper tongue asked which designer she was with. Mia didn't answer. The meal passed in polite murmurs and awkward silences. Every time Mia reached for a utensil or adjusted her seat, it was as if the table braced for something unexpected, something that would justify their discomfort. There was none. She cut her food with practiced ease. She drank her water slowly. She offered no commentary, no reaction, no explanation. Some guests watched her as though waiting for her to flinch, to break, to reveal that she didn't belong here. But she never did. And as the dessert plates were cleared and the lights dimmed for the unveiling of the exhibit, the truth lingered between them. Not yet spoken, but present. Mia wasn't lost. She was exactly where she was meant to be. They just hadn't figured it out yet. The glow from the high ceilings of the museum had shifted subtly, a signal to the guests that the dinner portion of the evening was nearing its end, and the transition into the exhibit presentation would soon begin. Yet the atmosphere remained tense in certain corners, especially around table 6, where one woman sat among magnates and muses like a stone in a field of gems, too solid, too grounded, too unexplained. The dessert plates had been cleared, though most of them were left untouched. Conversation at Mia's table thinned into fragmented sentences and awkward chuckles. The room was not as loud as it had been an hour before. Whispers, however, had multiplied. They slithered across the tables, curled around wine glasses, and flicked across shoulders like invisible silk scarves. And always, somewhere in those whispers, was her name, though no one had dared to say it aloud. Or rather, no one knew it. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't needed to, and that was the problem. In a space so obsessed with visibility, with curated images and tags and press releases, an unknown element unsettled the entire equation. It provoked discomfort. It sowed doubt. An untagged guest was like a glitch in the algorithm, a silent scandal with no headline. At a nearby table, 2 junior stylists leaned toward their creative director. They were young, ambitious, and desperate to seem in the know. "She's not on the guest list Vogue posted," one of them whispered. "Or on Getty. I checked. She must be someone's +1. Maybe a tech billionaire's girlfriend?" The creative director, a woman in her 50s with icy posture and a jaw clenched like a trap, didn't look up from her plate. "If she were with someone important, we'd know by now." That summation settled over them like a decree. The stylist nodded, reassured, but then one of them glanced back at Mia and frowned. "She's not trying to be noticed. That's the strangest part. It's like she's watching." On the other side of the room, a fashion journalist tapped away at her phone beneath the tablecloth, typing with the practiced discretion of someone trained in elite gossip. Her editor had texted her minutes ago. Find out who the woman in black is. Our audience is asking. She zoomed in on a grainy photo taken from the mezzanine. Mia, seated upright at table 6, her expression unreadable, her body perfectly still, like she was both part of the event and somehow outside of it. The journalist forwarded the image to 2 PR firms, 1 freelance photographer, and a social media consultant with a note. Any clue who she is? None of them replied. Mia noticed, of course, not the phones exactly, not the glances that skimmed her shoulders like skipping stones, but the hum, the shift in current, the way eyes didn't just glance, they lingered, calculated, assessed. At her table, a man with an Italian accent leaned over. His teeth gleamed under the amber lighting. His tuxedo was velvet. "You're very composed," he said. "May I ask, who invited you tonight?" His tone was conversational, curious even, but there was a weight behind the words, a subtle demand. Identify yourself, declare your purpose, validate your presence. Mia looked at him, then returned her gaze to the center of the table. "Same as everyone else," she said quietly. "An invitation." The answer was deliberately neutral. It gave him nothing. He blinked, forced a smile, and turned away. The woman beside him, a jewelry heiress wearing a necklace that rivaled the GDP of a small country, narrowed her eyes. "She's not wearing any statement pieces," she whispered to her date. "Not even earrings. That dress has no visible seam work. It could be vintage, or it could be nothing." Her date chuckled. "She's probably someone's social experiment, performance art." Another whisper, another theory. Someone suggested she was an archivist. Someone else guessed she was with the museum board. A few murmured about a hidden contest winner or a philanthropist going incognito. Theories bloomed like mold, desperate, speculative, fed by uncertainty. Even the servers had begun to notice. One of them, a tall young man with close-cropped hair and anxious shoulders, hesitated before offering Mia a refill of sparkling water. "I'm sorry," he said, fumbling slightly. "I thought I didn't mean—" "It's fine," she said. Her voice was soft but final. He nodded, grateful for the exit, and hurried away. Nearby, a well-known actress turned in her seat, ostensibly to adjust her train, but really to get a better look. "She's not press," she muttered to her assistant. "She's not from the council. I think I'd know her face." The assistant consulted her phone. "She's not on any major lists. No red carpet ID, no features, nothing. She doesn't even have a publicist hovering. Maybe she is one." They paused, considering. "If she were a publicist," the actress finally said, "she'd be behind someone, not at the table." And yet, there Mia was, sitting in perfect posture, neither defensive nor apologetic, as if the seat was hers by right, and no other explanation was needed. Anna Wintour passed by their table at that moment, her signature glasses fixed forward, her stride even. For a moment, her head tilted, just slightly, toward table 6. Then she kept walking. That was the moment several guests began to suspect something they couldn't articulate. A glitch, a dissonance, because Anna Wintour didn't tilt her head at just anyone. Back at table 6, Mia reached for her napkin. The woman, seated to her left, shifted, barely but noticeably, away from her, as if contact might stain her silk dress. When Mia caught the motion in her periphery, she said nothing. But the woman, perhaps embarrassed by her own reaction, leaned in and whispered with brittle brightness, "You look lovely." There was a pause long enough to hold a different word, one not spoken, one closer to unexpected, or different, Or wrong? Mia nodded once. Thank you. The woman turned back to her neighbor and whispered something behind her wine glass. Her table-mate laughed, short and tight, like a cough disguised as cruelty. The laughter didn't reach Mia. It skimmed the surface of her, unable to penetrate. She had heard it too many times before, in galleries, in boardrooms, and hallways after closed-door meetings. It was always the same laugh, the kind that sounds like it isn't meant to hurt until you realize it's meant to cut clean. Half an hour passed. Then came the seating correction. A young woman approached the table, visibly nervous, holding a place card between manicured fingers. She wore a designer gown so tight it restricted her breath, her face powdered to the point of concealment. She leaned toward Mia. I think you may be in the wrong seat, she said. Mia didn't flinch. She looked at the card in the woman's hand, then calmly turned over her own. Table 6, seat 3, she said. The woman glanced down. Hers read table 11. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She stepped back like she'd touched something hot. I'm so sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean to. I thought... She trailed off, laughing weakly, trying to brush away the moment with a shrug. You just didn't look like you were from around here, she said. Then she turned and fled. At that point, the tension around the table became almost physical. It clung to the edges of the floral centerpiece, twisted in the folds of linen napkins. No one said anything. No one knew what to say. The performance was complete. Mia had been evaluated, questioned, corrected, and had remained immovable. Someone had even snapped a photo of her discreetly, holding their phone just above the rim of their wine glass. The flash was disabled. The photo was taken, sent, whispered about, but none of them were truly looking at her. They weren't trying to see her. They were trying to solve her, categorize her, fold her into a box small enough to dismiss. But the folds wouldn't hold. The image didn't align. And that, more than anything, made them uneasy. The silence didn't grow. It settled. By the time the lights dimmed for the exhibition presentation, Mia had said little, moved little, and revealed nothing. And yet, somehow, the room could no longer ignore her. The lights dimmed with the slow majesty of a cathedral closing its nave to the public. Soft brass tones hummed from the overhead speakers as all conversation dissolved into a silence shaped more by curiosity than reverence. Guests shifted in their seats, some straightening their posture with mechanical grace, others stealing last sips of wine before the room's attention would be redirected toward what they had gathered to witness. It was the moment the evening had been designed around, the unveiling of the exhibit, a curated journey into the forgotten icons of fashion history, the theme that had inspired the gowns, the performances, the donors, the pageantry. A single spotlight illuminated the grand dais at the far end of the room, where the museum's director stepped forward. He wore a suit cut with careful restraint, a nod to elegance without opulence. The murmurs dwindled to nothing. His voice, when it came, was clear and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "on behalf of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Costume Institute, I welcome you to this year's Met Gala. Tonight is not only a celebration of couture, but of memory, of names whispered through time, designs hidden in archives, creativity overlooked by history. Our exhibit, Forgotten Icons, Reclaiming the Silent Thread, is the culmination of years of research, restoration, and vision." Applause followed, polite and restrained, the kind that comes from obligation rather than enthusiasm. But the director was undeterred. He gestured subtly to a series of shadowed glass enclosures lining the eastern gallery. where, hidden behind velvet drapes and dimmed glass, the exhibit waited. As many of you know, this year's theme seeks not just to honor those who shaped fashion, but those who were deliberately omitted from its story. Names that never appeared on runways, faces that were never framed by magazine covers, yet whose fingerprints linger on the seams of what we wear even today. The lights above the cases flickered to life, not all at once, but in slow succession, as if time itself were unfolding. One by one, the silhouettes of garments appeared, and the room collectively leaned forward. There was a hush, different from the previous silences. Not expectant, but unsteady. Guests gazed at the pieces behind glass with expressions that ranged from polite detachment to hesitant surprise. These were not gowns worn by movie stars or designs immortalized by Paris ateliers. These were unfamiliar, raw, immaculately restored but untouched by contemporary fame. One case revealed a sculpted jacket, hand-stitched from repurposed military fabric dated 1943. The plaque beneath it bore a name most had never heard: Claudine Richards, a black seamstress from Louisiana who had designed for her local community under threat of segregation laws. Another case displayed a bridal gown, simple and elegant, created in 1919 by Essie Mensah, a Ghanaian immigrant who had sewn for Harlem's elite in the shadows of Prohibition. Whispers returned, hushed and clipped. Were these real designers? I've never heard of them. Why are they being featured here? Is this a political thing? But Mia, seated still at table 6, did not look toward the cases like the others. She looked at the crowd. She studied the furrowed brows of stylists confused by what they saw, the defensive smiles of critics unsure of how to frame this narrative, the way some of the most famous guests in the room shifted uncomfortably, as if the exhibit had unexpectedly become a mirror they didn't want to look into. The director continued. Much of the work you'll see tonight was preserved only in fragments: photographs, sketches, oral history. But one contributor made it their mission to restore these pieces, to bring their colors and cuts and intentions back to life. Without them, this exhibit would not exist. There was no name given, no fanfare, just that pause, that acknowledgement. Mia's hands remained folded in her lap. She didn't need the credit, not yet, not in this room. Applause broke again, this time a little louder, though still tentative. A server passed by her table and paused, glancing at her with a flicker of recognition he hadn't had earlier in the evening. He offered her a fresh glass of water with a hand that was steadier now. She nodded once, and he moved on. At the front of the hall, the director stepped aside as a second figure joined him, a senior curator of the Costume Institute, known for her conservative tastes and long tenure at the museum. She launched into a detailed explanation of the garments now visible behind the cases, pointing out the hand-beading, the rare textiles, the ways in which certain design elements had influenced mid-century couture without ever being attributed to their true creators. Guests wandered forward in small groups, glasses in hand, masks of polite interest fixed on their faces. Some took photos. Others lingered only long enough to appear engaged before retreating to the safer comfort of their tables. Mia rose from her seat, her movement neither abrupt nor showy. She stepped away from the table, her path unblocked. The exhibit awaited. As she approached the cases, the chatter softened behind her. She passed a pair of influencers who had earlier mocked her presence. One of them now stared at the bridal gown with a furrowed brow, her fingers scrolling on her phone as if trying to confirm what she was seeing with something familiar. The other whispered something too quiet to catch. Mia stopped in front of a case near the center of the gallery. Inside it stood a dress unlike the others. Midnight blue silk, high-necked, with an open back that dipped in a delicate curve. It was both modest and daring, a garment that defied time. The plaque below it read simply, "Designer unknown, 1948, South Carolina, donated anonymously." Her eyes rested on the dress with a stillness that held more weight than tears. She had found this piece herself, years ago, folded in a wooden chest in an attic riddled with mildew. It had taken 6 months to restore, 3 to trace its history, 2 more to confirm that its creator, a black woman named Ruth Langley, had never sold a single design under her own name. The irony, of course, was that a modern luxury house had stolen this exact silhouette for their 2007 winter collection. It had sold out globally. Mia had recognized it the moment she saw it on the runway. Now, here it stood, labeled "Designer Unknown," still unnamed, still fighting for the dignity it had always deserved. Behind her, a woman stepped closer. She had silver hair and wore a gown that glittered like crushed ice. She recognized Mia now, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel the absence of what she'd dismissed earlier. "You seem familiar," she said, her tone vague, laced with cautious curiosity. "Have we met before?" Mia didn't answer. She didn't need to. She turned her head towards the next case and stepped away, leaving the question to wither in the air behind her. More guests began to circulate. A few had finally begun to engage with the exhibit in earnest, taking notes, murmuring admiration for details they had never imagined. The tide was shifting, slowly, cautiously, but it was shifting. The final display, located at the very front of the exhibit, drew the largest crowd. Inside the largest case sat a tiara, not a wedding crown, not a pageant piece. This was a royal artifact, a diamond-encrusted tiara originally worn by Duchess Beatrice of Alsatia in 1884, on loan from a private European collection. It shimmered under the lights like it had just stepped out of myth. Gasps escaped lips. Phones were raised. A man in a velvet tuxedo breathed, "It's the grand jewel." But Mia, watching from behind the crowd, saw something different. She saw a relic, an object of obsession, a symbol of exclusion, of all that was prized by this world and all that was denied to those like the women she had brought back to life. She stepped back. At her table, the space remained empty. She would return to it soon, but for now her place was not among the guests pretending to honor what they had spent generations ignoring. Her place was here, among the ghosts. And yet, even now, they still didn't know. They didn't know she had curated every detail of this exhibit, that she had funded nearly half its restoration out of her own private account, that the anonymous patron they had applauded moments ago had been seated among them all evening, drinking water instead of champagne, wearing silence like silk. They had praised the exhibit. They had clapped for the stories. But they hadn't clapped for her. Not yet. And she was content to let them sit in that ignorance just a little while longer. The last lights above the exhibit dimmed gradually, casting the gallery in a warmer, more intimate glow. It was not a full return to darkness, but rather a rebalancing of attention. A silent cue that the evening would pivot once more toward its social core. Conversations reignited in hushed tones, now tinged with the tension of new knowledge. People had seen the garments. They had read the names. Or, more precisely, they had read the absences. "Designer unknown" was a phrase that had never felt so sharp, and now it echoed in the minds of those who prided themselves on knowing everything. Mia stood a short distance from the final display, the diamond tiara still winking beneath its glass like a trap disguised as treasure. She didn't move. Not yet. Around her, bodies shifted with uncertainty. Some guests murmured their way back to the dining area. Others hovered in the hallway between exhibit and ballroom as if unsure which direction to face, caught between reverence and embarrassment. She felt the weight of their disquiet as clearly as if it had been draped across her shoulders. The murmurs that had once followed her like flies, dismissive, snickering, unbothered, now clung more cautiously. There was hesitation in them now. The world of high fashion did not enjoy questions it could not answer, and Mia, simply by existing in their midst, had become a question they could not resolve. She turned, finally, and walked slowly back toward her table. The hem of her black dress moved like smoke, its whisper trailing over the marble with each step. When she arrived, the cluster of guests seated at table 6 fell quiet. Their expressions did not mirror welcome. Some were wary, some deflective, some resentful. One of them, a prominent editor known for her acid-tongued reviews, lifted her glass but did not toast. She simply held it between herself and Mia like a shield. No one spoke. Not to her. Not yet. Mia resumed her seat with grace that did not ask permission. She unfolded her napkin, smoothing it in her lap, and glanced at the new course being served, chilled citrus salad on brushed ceramic plates. Her fingers rested lightly on the utensils but did not move. She waited. The first strike came minutes later, subtle as always. The woman seated to her right, cloaked in layers of emerald silk, leaned closer with the posture of a confidant. "You know," she said, her voice feathered with practiced charm, "the exhibit was beautiful. Quite impactful." Mia did not reply. She inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement without invitation. The woman continued. "And that tiara, what a showstopper. It's not really for wearing, of course. It's a piece for the archive, for preservation. Not for nights like this." There it was, the gentle knife. "Not for you, not your kind, not your table." Mia looked forward, her gaze steady. "Preservation and presence are not mutually exclusive." The woman blinked. "I suppose." At another table, laughter erupted, sharp, brittle, rehearsed. It didn't involve her, not directly, but it rang out like a challenge. One of the guests lifted a glass and made a comment about playing dress-up with history. Another joined in with a joke about woke couture. A younger woman, seated across from Mia, shifted uncomfortably. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but a hand from her companion on her wrist silenced her. The room was tipping. The safe veneer of admiration was cracking. Then came the influencer. She approached from behind, wearing a pastel creation that sparkled with every step. Her voice was bright, too bright, loud enough to be heard by the nearby tables. "Excuse me," she said, smiling as if this were all perfectly normal. "Would you mind if I got a photo? I mean, everyone's talking about you now. The mystery woman. You're kind of the moment." Mia turned in her seat. The woman's phone was already out, ready to snap. There was no shame in her stance, only hunger. The kind that fed on novelty, controversy, virality. "No," Mia said softly. The influencer faltered. "Sorry?" "I would mind," Mia repeated, still without heat. "Please don't." The smile faded. A thin mask of confusion took its place, then a flicker of irritation. But she didn't press. She retreated, weaving back toward her table with a story to tell that would paint herself the injured party. The silence at Mia's table now pulsed with awareness. Something had changed. She was no longer the curiosity in the plain black dress. She was a woman who had refused to perform, and in this world, refusal was the deepest insult. Forks scraped awkwardly against plates. Wine glasses tilted but were not refilled. A few glanced towards the center stage, willing the host to reappear, to save them from this new discomfort. Their wish was granted minutes later when a clear voice echoed from the front of the ballroom. The master of ceremonies had returned, microphone in hand, his smile as crisp as his tuxedo. Guests turned in unison, grateful for the shift in attention. "And now," he declared, "the moment we've all been waiting for, the opening of bids for tonight's centerpiece, the Duchess Beatrice Alsatia tiara, a singular artifact valued at over $2 million. Applause rose, automatic and eager. The spotlight hit the glass case at the head of the exhibit once more, bathing the tiara in cold white light. It gleamed under the beam like it had been waiting for this moment all evening, like it had known the room would come crawling to it, desperate to claim what it symbolized. "Bidding will begin at $200,000, the host announced. "Do I hear 200,000? A hand lifted, smooth, assured, male. The room exhaled. 250? The host asked. Another hand rose, then another, then several more. The numbers climbed, 300, 400, 5. Each bid was a display, not of interest, but of identity. These were not people who wanted the tiara. They wanted to be seen bidding for it. They wanted others to see that they could. Mia watched the hands rise and fall, detached. This was not her world, though it unfolded around her like it believed she belonged nowhere else. The bidding paused at 700,000. Then came the voice. 2 million. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The room froze. Heads turned. The host blinked, his mouth slightly open, unsure if he'd misheard. And then, from the eastern archway, Victor Langston stepped into the light. He was tall, composed, dressed in a tuxedo so expertly tailored it seemed like it had been sewn onto him that morning. He moved with purpose, each step echoing slightly off the marble. He carried no wine glass, no entourage, no smile. "I'm not bidding," he said, and his voice carried like a bell. "I'm buying it." Gasps rippled through the room. The host stammered, That's not." Victor raised a hand. In it, a black envelope, slim and unadorned. "A wire transfer has already been initiated. In addition, a separate donation will be made to the museum, equivalent to the full valuation of the tiara's future conservation. Consider it no longer an auction item. Consider it acquired." The host took the envelope. He opened it. His eyes widened. He said nothing else. Victor turned, and his gaze swept the room only once, before landing directly on Mia, and then he walked toward her. Every phone lifted, every breath held. No one laughed now. He stopped in front of her chair and extended a hand. She took it without hesitation. He knelt, producing from his inner pocket a small velvet box. When it opened, the tiara sat inside, just as it had behind the glass. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. She stood. He placed it gently on her head. The tiara settled into her hair like it had been waiting all along. They didn't smile. They didn't pose. And the room, which had spent the entire evening trying to classify, dismiss, correct, and ignore her, fell into a silence that rang louder than the earlier laughter ever had. Not out of respect, out of fear. They realized, too late, that they had mocked the only person who could shut the whole place down. And now she wore the crown they could never afford. The moment stretched long after the tiara had been placed, longer still than the collective breath the ballroom had forgotten to release. Mia stood, unmoving, her posture erect, not rigid, but unshakably still, as if something deep beneath her skin had anchored itself to the marble floor and refused to yield. Victor remained by her side, his hand resting lightly against hers, not possessive, not protective, but solid and present. His expression did not change, and his gaze never left her face, not even when the sea of eyes around them gaped in open disbelief. Somewhere behind the frozen tableau, a champagne flute shattered on the marble. The sound was sharp and delicate, like a porcelain lye breaking in someone's hand. Still, no one moved. The gala, in all its grandeur and choreography, had collapsed inward in that instant, folding into a silence so complete it seemed almost holy. And within that silence there was only one truth. They had seen the crown claimed, not by any of them, but by the woman they had dismissed. The host, still holding the envelope Victor had handed him, finally found his voice. "Mr. Langston," he said, his tone unsteady, "we weren't aware you would be attending tonight." Victor turned to him, slowly, as though the question required a moment of consideration. His voice remained calm, deliberate. Clearly, a single word echoed through the hall, heavy with unspoken judgment. In that echo, faces shifted, spines straightened. The masks so carefully fixed for the occasion began to slip. It wasn't the power of Victor's presence alone that undid them. It was the weight of their own assumptions unraveling in real time. A sharp breath from the back of the room drew brief attention. It belonged to a woman seated at the rear of the hall, a socialite whose family name had been carved into the museum's donor plaques for 3 generations. She whispered something urgent to the man beside her. He blinked once, then twice, then turned pale. "Langston," he muttered under his breath. "As in the Langston Foundation?" Another name fell into place. Another silence deepened, and then the ripple began. It passed from one table to the next, each guest recalculating everything they'd seen that evening, every moment of laughter, every glance of dismissal, every whisper they'd breathed about the woman who now wore a crown on her head. Victor Langston was not merely wealthy. He was legacy. He was power. A self-made billionaire who had disrupted the tech sector before the age of 30 and then transformed that disruption into a philanthropic empire. The Langston Foundation had funded clean water projects, global education initiatives, and, in recent years, arts restoration and historical preservation across North America and Europe. Quietly, strategically, with precision and scale. But even more jarring than Victor's sudden emergence was what it meant for Mia, because he had not stood beside a celebrity. He had not crowned a starlet or a duchess or a rising designer. He had crowned her. And they still didn't know who she was. Not fully. Not yet. A voice from the press table finally broke the trance. It belonged to a journalist whose coverage of the gala had always leaned on spectacle more than substance. He stood now, clutching his phone, eyes darting between the couple. "Mr. Langston," he called, not quite shouting, "is this your fiancée?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked to Mia, a silent question in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod. Victor turned to the crowd, his tone quiet but unmistakable. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to introduce you all, officially, to the future Mrs. Langston." Another murmur rolled through the room. This time there was no laughter to accompany it. No one dared. Mia's name had not yet been spoken, but it was no longer necessary. Her presence had eclipsed every title, every designer, every influencer in the room. And now that she stood unveiled, not by the spotlight, but by the power she had never needed to announce, There was nothing left to do but witness her. But Mia was not finished. She looked out across the crowd, scanning the faces that had turned toward her not long ago in ridicule. She recognized them all: the woman who had asked if she was catering, the man who had questioned her seat, the influencer who had asked for a photo, the editor who had raised a glass like a barrier. They were statues now, frozen in their designer gowns and $1,000 shoes, imprisoned by the weight of their own misjudgment. Then she stepped forward. She released Victor's hand and walked calmly to the center of the room, where the host had retreated several steps to make space for whatever would happen next. She took the microphone from its stand without asking. She didn't smile. She didn't pause. Her voice was smooth, resonant, and controlled. "This will be our last time attending," she said simply. A collective breath caught. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. She didn't owe them anything. Victor moved to her side again, holding a second envelope identical to the first. He handed it to the host. "I've also decided," he added, "to match the total of this evening's auction proceeds with a final donation. Consider it a farewell gift." The host, visibly struggling to contain the emotions curling through his expression, disbelief, panic, apology, took the envelope with trembling fingers. I see," he said, his voice strained. The statement was meant to be polite, but it landed with a dull thud in the room's weighted atmosphere. It was clear that he did not, in fact, see anything clearly at all. Mia turned once more toward the crowd. Her gaze was not cold, but neither was it kind. It was the gaze of someone who had been forced to endure what she had already transcended. She looked past the sparkle, past the flash, past the carefully assembled illusions of status, and saw nothing that could touch her anymore. She descended from the dais with Victor beside her, their movements synchronized by something older than habit. The crowd parted before them like water yielding to gravity. No one reached out. No one spoke. Even the press had gone silent, their fingers limp against screens that had suddenly forgotten what to say. At the entrance to the museum, a pair of attendants opened the doors. The night air spilled in, cool and unfiltered, curling around the marble like a benediction. Their car was already waiting. Mia stepped into the night with the tiara still resting lightly atop her head. It was no longer a symbol of status. It was a reminder, a reckoning, a monument to every time someone had decided that silence meant weakness, that simplicity meant insignificance, that blackness meant servitude. Victor opened the door for her. She slid inside without a word. He followed. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, no one called after them. No one followed. They couldn't. You cannot pursue what you failed to see. Inside the car, the city fell away behind the tinted glass. Mia leaned back into the seat, exhaling not in relief but in clarity. She didn't look back. There was nothing left behind her worth turning toward. Victor reached for her hand. His palm was warm, but his grasp did not seek comfort. It simply was. "You were the only jewel in that room," he said quietly. She didn't respond, because she already knew. The limousine moved soundlessly down Fifth Avenue, its sleek body gliding past shuttered storefronts and empty sidewalks. The city had thinned in the hours since the gala began, but its lights still burned, scattered across glass towers like constellations fallen to earth. Inside the vehicle, silence reigned, not the brittle kind that strained against words unspoken, but the kind that followed something complete. Final. Mia sat with her back straight, the tiara still perched atop her head, unshaken by the ride, undimmed by the artificial lights beyond the windows. She did not speak. She did not fidget. She merely looked forward, as though the future were unfolding just beyond the windshield. Victor sat beside her, his presence no less assured than it had been in the ballroom. He hadn't taken her hand again, nor had she reached for his. They didn't need to. They existed in the same quiet current, a force neither of them had to name to understand. Occasionally, the passing blur of a camera flash lit up the window behind them. Delayed attempts from distant photographers, still hoping to salvage a story from the departure. But none dared approach the vehicle. Not anymore. Inside the museum, the guests had remained frozen long after the doors closed behind them. Some had finally begun to murmur again. Aimless phrases, questions with no answers, speculations too foolish to speak aloud. A few had approached the host, stumbling over pleasantries, hoping to regain their footing in the wake of the Foundation's withdrawal. He had no words for them. His fingers still clutched the envelope, now slightly creased from how tightly he had held it. The weight of its contents was more than financial. It was historic. It was irreversible. Others wandered back into the exhibit as if trying to reconstruct the night from pieces. They peered once more at the garments, read and reread the placards, searching for clues they had missed. Some paused before the midnight blue dress and murmured guesses about its true designer. Others stood longer at the designer unknown labels, not with curiosity but with shame. No one laughed anymore. Mia's absence echoed louder than her presence ever had. Her name had not been printed on the arrival lists. Her image had not trended on social media. And yet, she had become the singular story of the evening, not because she disrupted the gala, but because she had allowed it to proceed exactly as it always had. She let them mock her, dismiss her, underestimate her. She let them believe they held the power. And then she left with all of it. The limousine turned onto a quieter street, then slowed to a halt beside a tall townhouse with a private drive. The driver exited first, walking with calm precision to open Mia's door. He did not bow. He did not speak. He simply offered the gesture with a slight dip of the head, an act of familiarity rather than service. She stepped out, the hem of her dress brushing the curb with the same ease it had kissed the marble earlier that night. Victor joined her on the sidewalk, pausing beside her as the car pulled away into the night. For a moment, they stood there, side by side, neither rushing to enter the building. The air was cooler now, tinged with that faint scent of stone and iron that only appeared after midnight in New York. Mia looked up. The townhouse before them was old, dignified, its windows darkened but not unwelcoming. It was hers, one of the few details about her life that the world did not yet know and perhaps never would. She had bought it 5 years ago, under a quiet holding name, long before she had met Victor, long before she had become a curator or a patron or anything worth publishing. It had once belonged to a black suffragist who died before the world gave her a single monument. Mia had never remodeled it. She hadn't needed to. Victor opened the door with a key of his own, and they entered without ceremony. Inside, the lights glowed softly from recessed sconces. A dog-eared book lay open on the end table. A shawl hung over the back of a reading chair. The house bore the stillness of a life lived deliberately. There were no velvet ropes, no curated portraits, no showpieces meant to impress. Only history. Only purpose. Victor set his cufflinks on a small tray near the door and slipped off his jacket. He didn't ask if Mia wanted tea or wine or to talk. He knew she wouldn't. Instead, he stepped quietly into the adjoining room, leaving her alone in the hallway. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting lightly on the stair rail, the tiara still in place, though its meaning had changed. It was no longer a spectacle, no longer a symbol of reclamation or defiance. It was simply an object, now neutral, stripped of the power others had projected onto it. She removed it gently and carried it to the bookshelf, where she placed it beside a row of rare texts, memoirs by seamstresses and housekeepers, ledgers kept by nameless designers who had worked in shadows while others claimed the light. She did not place it on a pedestal or in a case. She set it among the stories where it belonged. Upstairs, the faint sound of jazz filtered from an old speaker, low and undemanding. She climbed the staircase at her own pace, not weary but full. At the top landing, she paused again, looking down at the foyer where a small framed photograph stood on a console table. It was a black and white portrait of her grandmother, young and radiant, seated at a sewing machine in a room full of bolts and thread. Mia had never known her in person, but she had known her legacy. That photograph had sat on every desk Mia ever worked at. It had watched her through internships, fellowships, empty hallways, closed doors, and every moment she'd been told she was too quiet, too serious, too black, too something. Tonight, for the first time, it had not watched her as a reminder to endure, but as a witness to triumph. She smiled then, small, private, unrecorded. Back in the museum, the aftermath unfolded in predictable patterns. Articles were drafted and redrafted, headlines debated. The Woman in Black, Met Gala's unseen power play. Victor Langston's fiancée breaks the internet without saying a word. Who is Mia Daniels? The museum staff would meet the following morning, somber and nervous, unsure how to undo what had been done. The host would apologize via statement, and the council would circulate internal memos about inclusivity optics. None of it would matter. The Langston Foundation's withdrawal would ripple through their funding cycles like a fracture in glass. And Mia? She would not return. Not to the Met Gala, not to the donor board, not to any space that required her to shrink in order to be respected. Instead, her name would begin to appear elsewhere, on endowments, on new collections, on scholarship grants and lecture series, and always, behind those names, there would be no performance, no spectacle, only the echo of a woman who once sat at the center of a room and said nothing at all, and in doing so, revealed everything. They would try to spin the story. They would say she surprised them. They would claim she arrived out of nowhere. But it wouldn't be true. She had walked in through the front doors, same as they had. No cameras, no name tags, no pageantry. She'd been there the entire time. They had simply never seen her. And now, they would see her everywhere. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it.